The quickest way to reveal a person's character is to hand them a moment of power and watch what they do with it. The lunch rush transformed the elegant Manhattan restaurant into a carefully choreographed rhythm of polished silverware, crystal glasses, quiet conversations, and perfectly timed service. Sunlight spilled through towering windows overlooking the busy avenue, while expensive suits filled nearly every table. Claire Bennett moved gracefully between guests wearing a neatly pressed black apron over a crisp white shirt, balancing heavy trays with steady hands and greeting every customer with the same calm warmth. She never rushed, never complained, and never seemed distracted by the constant pressure surrounding her. Most guests barely noticed the quiet waitress. To them, she was simply another part of the restaurant, as ordinary as the linen napkins and polished marble floor. The front doors opened, and Ethan Carter entered beside his 11-year-old daughter, Emma. He wore a tailored navy jacket that reflected understated success rather than extravagance, yet the fatigue behind his eyes could not be hidden. His morning had been consumed by tense board meetings, unexpected financial negotiations, and a phone that had not stopped ringing since sunrise. Emma quietly walked beside him, carrying a small sketchbook beneath her arm. She had been looking forward to this lunch for weeks because time alone with her father had become increasingly rare. Claire welcomed them with a gentle smile before guiding them toward a quiet window table. She placed 2 glasses of water beside neatly folded menus and wished them a pleasant afternoon. Ethan barely looked up from another business call. Emma thanked Claire with genuine kindness before opening her sketchbook and beginning another drawing while waiting for her father to finish speaking. Minutes later, a nearby server accidentally brushed against Claire while turning too quickly around a crowded corner. The unexpected movement caused one empty crystal glass on Claire's tray to slide toward the edge. She reacted instantly, catching the tray before it could fall, but the glass slipped free, striking the polished floor. With a sharp crack that echoed across the dining room, every nearby conversation stopped. Heads turned. Claire immediately knelt to gather the harmless shattered pieces before anyone could accidentally step on them. She quietly apologized to the surrounding guests, even though the accident had not truly been her fault. Ethan ended his phone call at the exact moment the sound reached his table. Already exhausted and frustrated, he looked toward the commotion with visible irritation. His expensive suit had been lightly splashed by a few drops of water from the broken glass. It was barely noticeable, but his patience had already been worn thin long before he entered the restaurant. Claire stood respectfully beside the table. "I am very sorry, sir. Are you all right?" she asked calmly. Ethan looked directly into her eyes, anger speaking before reason could catch it. "Do you even understand what professionalism means?" Claire remained silent. Ethan continued, his voice louder than he realized. "People like you never think beyond the next mistake." The restaurant became painfully quiet. Emma slowly lowered her pencil. Claire's expression did not change. She simply listened. Ethan took one more breath, still trapped inside the frustration of an entirely different day, and spoke the sentence that instantly froze the entire room. "You are nothing." Silence settled across every table. Several diners looked away uncomfortably, while others stared in disbelief. Claire did not defend herself. She did not argue. She did not cry. Instead, she gently straightened her black apron, looked at Ethan with calm, unwavering eyes, and offered the faintest, coldest smile. It was not a smile of anger or revenge. It was the quiet smile of someone whose worth had never depended on another person's opinion. Emma looked from her father to Claire, sensing that something far more important than a broken glass had just happened. The silence inside the restaurant lingered for several long seconds after Ethan Carter's words faded into the air. Even the quiet music drifting through the dining room suddenly seemed distant. Claire Bennett remained standing beside the table with both hands resting lightly against her black apron. Her calm expression never changed. She neither challenged Ethan nor searched the room for sympathy. She simply inclined her head with quiet professionalism. "I apologize for disturbing your lunch," she said gently. "I will have someone replace your table setting immediately." Her voice carried no trace of resentment. That unexpected composure unsettled several guests far more than an angry response ever could. Emma looked at her father with uncertainty. She had seen him negotiate billion-dollar agreements without raising his voice. She had watched him comfort her after difficult days at school. The The man sitting across from her suddenly seemed like a stranger. "Dad?" she whispered carefully. "I think it was just an accident." Ethan did not answer. The pressure of the morning still clouded his judgment. Claire quietly gathered the remaining pieces of broken glass into a small tray before stepping away from the table. Another server immediately arrived to replace the water glasses and apologize once more. Claire disappeared toward the service station without looking back. Several employees glanced toward her with concern, but she simply thanked them for their help and continued preparing drinks for waiting customers. Her steady hands revealed nothing of what she might have been feeling inside. Across the dining room, the restaurant manager approached Ethan with polite professionalism. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Your meal will be complimentary today." Ethan nodded briefly, still convinced the matter had ended. The manager thanked him and quietly walked away. Emma continued watching Claire instead. She noticed something that surprised her. Claire greeted the next family with exactly the same warm smile she had offered before the accident. She laughed softly with a little boy who proudly showed her a drawing. She patiently helped an elderly couple choose their lunch. She poured coffee for another guest with the same graceful movements as though nothing unpleasant had happened only moments earlier. Emma frowned thoughtfully. "How is she not angry?" she asked. Ethan followed his daughter's gaze. Claire never once looked toward their table. She simply continued working. "Maybe she is hiding it," he answered. Emma slowly shook her head. "That does not look fake." Meanwhile, inside the employee hallway behind the dining room, one of Claire's co-workers quietly touched her shoulder. "Are you all right?" Claire offered a small smile. "Yes. You do not have to pretend with us." Claire folded a fresh linen napkin before answering. "I am not pretending." Her co-worker looked at her with concern. What he said was unfair. Claire paused for only a moment. His words described the person he believed he was speaking to. "They do not describe who I am." The co-worker fell silent. Claire picked up another tray and returned to the dining room before another table waited too long. Unaware of that private conversation, Ethan watched her continue serving every guest with the same quiet dignity. Something about her calmness began to disturb him in a way he could not yet explain. He had expected embarrassment, anger, or tears. Instead, she had given him nothing except a composed smile that seemed untouched by his opinion. Emma quietly closed her sketchbook. During the uncomfortable silence, she drew one final line beneath the unfinished picture before looking toward Claire again. For the first time that afternoon, she wondered whether the strongest person in the restaurant was not the billionaire sitting across from her, but the quiet waitress who had refused to let a stranger decide her worth. Lunch continued, but something invisible had shifted inside the elegant restaurant. Conversation slowly returned, forks touched porcelain again, and soft music reclaimed the silence. Yet Emma Carter could not concentrate on the meal sitting untouched before her. Every few seconds her eyes drifted back toward Claire Bennett as the quiet waitress continued moving gracefully between tables with the same measured pace she had shown before the accident. She welcomed new guests with a gentle smile, patiently answered questions about the menu, and thanked every customer with genuine warmth. If someone had entered the restaurant at that moment, they would never have guessed she had just endured public humiliation only minutes earlier. Emma finally looked across the table at her father. "Do you ever wish you could take words back?" she asked quietly. Ethan Carter paused before answering. He had already begun replaying the scene inside his own mind, though pride refused to let him admit it. "Sometimes," he replied carefully. Emma lowered her eyes to the sketchbook resting beside her plate. "Mom used to tell me that words stay with people longer than we think." Ethan remained silent. Mentioning Emma's mother always softened the room around them. Since losing her several years earlier, he had devoted himself to protecting his daughter and expanding the company she had once believed in alongside him. Somewhere along that journey, endless responsibility had slowly replaced patience. Claire approached their table carrying fresh bread for several guests seated nearby. She noticed Emma watching her and offered the little girl the same quiet smile she offered everyone else. Emma smiled back instinctively. Ethan expected Claire to ignore him completely, yet before walking away she simply asked, "Would either of you like more water?" Her tone remained calm, respectful, and entirely professional. Ethan looked up, momentarily surprised. "Yes," he answered almost automatically. Claire carefully refilled both glasses without hesitation. There was no trace of sarcasm. no coldness hidden beneath politeness. Once finished, she inclined her head slightly and continued toward another table. Ethan watched her disappear across the dining room. The absence of bitterness unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Near the service station, two newer employees quietly whispered while organizing clean dishes. One glanced toward Ethan's table before speaking softly. "I do not know how she stays so calm." The older server beside him smiled knowingly. "Claire believes every person is carrying a battle we cannot see. She never lets someone else's difficult day become the reason she loses herself." Ethan happened to overhear the final sentence as he reached for his coffee. He pretended not to notice, but the words settled heavily in his thoughts. A few minutes later, an elderly gentleman entered the restaurant using a polished wooden cane. Before any employee could reach him, Claire crossed the room and gently opened the door wider, helping him step safely across the entrance without drawing unnecessary attention. She greeted him by name, remembered his favorite table near the window, and quietly asked whether his granddaughter had recovered from her recent illness. The old man smiled with visible gratitude. "She is doing much better," he answered warmly. "Thank you for remembering." Claire simply nodded and escorted him to his seat before returning to her work. Emma watched the entire exchange. "She remembers everyone," she whispered. Ethan looked toward the elderly customer, laughing softly as Claire poured his tea. For the first time that afternoon, a quiet question entered his mind. If someone capable of showing that much care to complete strangers could remain composed after being insulted in front of an entire restaurant, perhaps the person he had judged so quickly possessed a strength he had completely failed to recognize. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the restaurant windows as the lunch crowd settled into quieter conversations. Claire Bennett continued serving each table with the same calm attention that had become second nature. She carried fresh coffee to one corner, remembered another guest's favorite dessert without being asked, and gently reassured a nervous young couple celebrating their first wedding anniversary. Nothing in her expression suggested that only a short time earlier she had stood in the center of the dining room while harsh words echoed around her. Ethan Carter found himself watching almost every movement without intending to. He had built an entire career studying people, negotiating difficult situations, and recognizing weakness before anyone else noticed it. Yet Claire refused to fit any pattern he understood. She had not defended herself. She had not sought sympathy. More surprisingly, she had not treated him any differently afterward. Every glass she refilled, every polite reply, and every quiet smile remained exactly the same. Emma noticed the thoughtful expression on her father's face. "You keep looking at her," she said softly. Ethan gave a faint smile. "I am trying to understand something." Emma tilted her head. "What?" Ethan hesitated before answering. Why someone who was treated unfairly would still choose kindness? Emma looked toward Claire again. Maybe because kindness was never for other people. Maybe it is for herself. Ethan did not respond immediately. His daughter had inherited her mother's quiet wisdom, and sometimes her simplest observations carried more truth than lengthy business discussions. At that moment, another customer accidentally knocked a cup of coffee from the edge of a nearby table. The mug tipped sideways, spilling across the white tablecloth before dripping onto the polished floor. The embarrassed customer immediately stood. "I am so sorry," he said. Before anyone else could react, Claire walked over carrying fresh towels. "Please do not worry," she said with an easy smile. "Coffee can be replaced much faster than a pleasant afternoon." The customer laughed with visible relief. Claire cleaned the table efficiently, replaced the drink with a fresh cup, and wished the family an enjoyable meal before quietly walking away. Ethan watched the entire exchange. The customer had made a larger mess than the broken glass earlier, yet Claire had not allowed him to feel ashamed. A quiet memory returned unexpectedly. He heard his own voice repeating the words he had spoken only an hour before. They sounded harsher now than they had in the moment. Near the kitchen entrance, the restaurant manager stopped beside Claire while reviewing the afternoon schedule. "You handled yourself well today," he said quietly. Claire smiled gently. "Thank you." The manager looked toward Ethan's table. "If you would like me to speak with that gentleman, I will." Claire shook her head almost immediately. "There is no need." "After everything he said?" the manager asked. Claire carefully folded a clean napkin before placing it onto a serving tray. Some people carry burdens they never intended to share. Today his burden simply became louder than his kindness. The manager studied her face for a moment before smiling with quiet admiration. I hope you never lose that way of seeing people. Claire answered softly, I hope none of us do. Unaware that Ethan had overheard nearly every word while passing near the hallway on his way back from a phone call, Claire returned to the dining room once again. Ethan remained standing for several silent seconds before slowly returning to his table. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering whether success had gradually taught him how to judge people more quickly than he understood them. Emma Carter quietly pushed her lunch plate aside, even though she had barely eaten. Her attention remained fixed on Claire Bennett as the young waitress continued moving through the restaurant with the same calm confidence that had quietly transformed the atmosphere around her. Every guest received the same genuine smile. Every request was answered with patience. Every conversation ended with simple kindness. Emma finally looked across the table at her father. Dad, she asked softly, if someone spoke to me the way you spoke to her today, what would you want me to do? Ethan Carter lowered his coffee cup without answering immediately. The question lingered between them longer than he expected. He thought about the advice he had given Emma throughout her childhood. Be respectful. Be patient. Never let anger choose your words. Yet only an hour earlier, he had broken every lesson he had tried to teach his daughter. I would tell you not to let another person's anger decide who you become, he answered quietly. Emma nodded, then looked back toward Claire. That is exactly what she did. Ethan followed her gaze once again. Claire was kneeling beside a little girl whose stuffed rabbit had slipped beneath another table. She carefully retrieved the toy, brushed a little dust from one ear, and returned it with a warm smile. The child hugged the rabbit tightly, while her parents thanked Claire for taking the extra moment instead of rushing away. Claire simply wished them a pleasant afternoon before continuing her work. Nearby, two longtime regular customers greeted her by name. One elderly woman smiled warmly. Claire, my husband finally finished physical therapy. Claire's face brightened with sincere happiness. That is wonderful news. I know how hard he worked for it. The woman laughed gently. You remembered. Claire nodded. Some victories deserve to be remembered. Ethan noticed how naturally those conversations unfolded. People did not seem to like Claire because she worked in the restaurant. They trusted her because she remembered their lives beyond the menu. As the afternoon became quieter, Emma excused herself to wash her hands. Passing the service station, she noticed a small bulletin board where employees had pinned handwritten thank you notes from customers collected over the years. Curious, she stopped for a closer look. One note read, "Thank you for treating my father with dignity during his final visit before hospice care." Another simply said, "Your kindness helped me through the hardest day of my life." Several cards mentioned Claire by name. None praised perfect service or quick meals. Every message spoke about compassion, patience, or feeling truly seen. Emma stood silently reading each one until Claire happened to walk past carrying fresh bread. She smiled kindly. Did you find our little wall of memories? Emma nodded. People really love you. Claire laughed softly. I think they love being treated with respect. I just happened to be nearby. Before Emma could ask another question, a kitchen bell rang, signaling another order was ready. Claire excused herself and returned to work without another thought. Emma slowly walked back toward the table carrying something invisible that no one else could see. It was not evidence against her father. It was proof that quiet character often reveals itself through hundreds of unnoticed moments instead of one dramatic act. Ethan watched his daughter return with a thoughtful expression he recognized well. It was the same expression her mother used to wear whenever she had discovered a truth that could not be ignored. Without realizing it, he had come to the restaurant believing success gave him the ability to measure another person's value. As he looked around the dining room once more, he began wondering whether the greatest mistake of his day had not been losing his temper, but believing he had the right to decide what another human being was worth. The afternoon finally began to slow, and the constant rhythm of the restaurant softened into a quieter pace. Claire Bennett carefully arranged fresh silverware for the evening guests while sunlight faded into the warm glow of hanging chandeliers. The tension from earlier had disappeared from the room, yet it lingered silently inside Ethan Carter's thoughts. Every time he looked toward Claire, he expected to find some trace of resentment hidden behind her calm expression. Instead, he found only quiet focus. She spoke kindly to every guest, thanked the kitchen staff after each completed order, and even stopped to encourage a nervous new server struggling through her first day. "You are doing better than you think," Claire said with an encouraging smile. "Take one table at a time. Nobody becomes confident in a single afternoon." The young server smiled with visible relief. "Thank you. I thought everyone noticed my mistakes." Claire gently shook her head. "Most people remember how you made them feel long before they remember anything you spilled." Ethan overheard the exchange while signing a business document on his tablet. He slowly lowered the device onto the table. Once again, Claire had quietly turned another person's difficult moment into renewed confidence. Emma watched as well. "She always knows exactly what someone needs to hear," she whispered. Ethan nodded almost absent-mindedly. Yes. It was the first time all afternoon that his answer came without hesitation. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager stopped beside Claire while reviewing the following week's schedule. "I know you have already covered 3 extra shifts," he said apologetically. "I hate asking again, but Michael's daughter is sick. Would you be willing to take his Saturday evening shift?" Claire glanced briefly at the calendar before smiling. "Of course." The manager looked concerned. "You have not had a full weekend off in months." Claire answered quietly. "He needs to be with his family more than I need another free evening." The manager thanked her sincerely before walking away. Ethan happened to witness the conversation from across the room. He noticed Claire never negotiated for higher pay, special treatment, or recognition. She simply chose to help because someone else needed her. Emma leaned forward. "Dad, do you think she always says yes?" Ethan looked thoughtful. "I do not know." Their server, who had been refilling nearby coffee cups, happened to overhear the question. She smiled politely before speaking. "Honestly, almost always. Claire covered my shifts after my surgery last winter. She never told anyone she was doing it. I only found out because payroll accidentally mentioned the extra hours." Ethan looked up with genuine curiosity. "Did she ever ask for anything in return?" The server laughed softly. That would not sound like Claire. She gathered the empty dishes and continued working, leaving Ethan quietly staring through the restaurant toward the young waitress once again. Something inside him shifted a little more. Success had taught him to measure people by achievements, credentials, and influence. Claire seemed to live by an entirely different standard. She measured people by the opportunities they had to make someone else's day lighter. As the afternoon drew closer to evening, Emma carefully closed her sketchbook and slid it across the table toward her father. "I finished my drawing," she said. Ethan opened it slowly. Instead of drawing the restaurant or their lunch, Emma had sketched a simple lighthouse standing against dark waves while tiny boats sailed safely toward its light. At the bottom, she had written one quiet sentence beneath the picture. "The strongest people do not make the loudest noise. They help others find their way." Ethan looked from the drawing to Claire, who was quietly carrying another tray through the dining room without realizing she had already become the lesson his daughter would remember long after this ordinary afternoon had ended. The restaurant finally settled into the gentle rhythm of late afternoon as sunlight faded into the soft amber glow of evening. Claire Bennett carried a fresh pot of coffee through the dining room, stopping briefly at familiar tables where regular customers greeted her by name. Every smile she offered looked exactly the same as it had before Ethan Carter's harsh words. It was not forced. It was not fragile. It simply belonged to the person she had chosen to become long before this day began. Ethan quietly watched her while Emma slowly finished the last few lines in her sketchbook. The silence between father and daughter no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it seemed filled with questions neither of them had expected to ask when they first walked through the restaurant doors. Emma finally looked up. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Always." She hesitated for a moment. "If someone spoke to Mom the way you spoke to Claire today, what would you have thought about that person?" Ethan lowered his eyes. The question struck him harder than any business failure ever had. He did not answer immediately because every honest answer pointed back at himself. "I would have believed that person forgot how much words can weigh," he admitted quietly. Emma reached across the table and gently closed his tablet. "Then maybe today is not about Claire anymore." Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet surprise. "What do you mean?" Emma smiled sadly. "Maybe it is about deciding what kind of person you want me to remember." Her words settled deep inside him. Across the dining room, Claire was helping an elderly couple divide one dessert into 2 smaller plates. She laughed softly when the husband insisted his wife deserved the larger slice. The moment lasted only seconds, yet everyone around the table smiled with them. Ethan realized she possessed a rare ability to make ordinary moments feel meaningful. Before leaving, the elderly woman quietly squeezed Claire's hand. "You always make this place feel like home." Claire answered gently, "That is the nicest compliment anyone can receive." As the couple slowly walked toward the exit, one of the kitchen employees approached Claire carrying a small stack of unopened envelopes. "Your mail came earlier," he said. "I almost forgot." Claire thanked him and slipped the envelopes into the pocket of her apron without opening them. There was no curiosity on her face. Work still came first. Ethan noticed the exchange but thought little of it until another long-time employee joined him while clearing nearby dishes. "She never opens personal mail during work," the employee said with a smile. "She says every customer deserves her full attention until her shift ends." Ethan looked toward Claire once again. "Has she always been like this?" The employee nodded without hesitation. "Since the first day she started here. She treats every responsibility as though someone important trusted her with it." Ethan quietly repeated the sentence inside his mind. Someone important trusted her with it. He suddenly realized Claire lived as though every ordinary task carried invisible value. Emma slipped her sketchbook into her backpack before standing beside the table. "Dad," she said softly, "I think she already forgave you." Ethan looked surprised. "Why would you think that?" Emma glanced toward Claire, who was smiling warmly while welcoming another family through the front doors. "Because people who hold on to anger do not smile like that." Ethan followed his daughter's gaze in silence. For the first time in many years, success, reputation, and wealth felt strangely insignificant compared with the quiet strength of a woman who had never allowed another person's judgment to become the measure of her own worth. At that moment, without speaking another word, he made a private decision. Before this story ended, he would learn who Claire Bennett truly was, not because she had impressed him, but because she had reminded him of the kind of person he once hoped he would never stop becoming. Several days passed after the afternoon that quietly changed everything inside the restaurant. Ethan Carter never mentioned the incident to anyone at work, yet Claire Bennett's calm smile continued returning to his thoughts during board meetings, late-night reports, and silent drives home. The louder the business world became, the more clearly he remembered the woman who had answered humiliation with dignity instead of anger. Early one Monday morning, after dropping Emma at school, Ethan asked his executive assistant for an unusual favor. "I need you to help me learn about someone," he said calmly. His assistant looked surprised. "A potential executive?" Ethan shook his head. "No, a waitress." She waited for more information. "Only facts," Ethan continued. "Do not contact her. Do not tell anyone I asked. I simply want to understand who she is." The request sounded unlike anything he had ever made before, but his assistant nodded professionally. "I will be discreet." Meanwhile, Claire's life continued exactly as it always had. Before sunrise, she boarded the downtown train carrying a small canvas bag filled with library books and a homemade lunch. She arrived at the restaurant nearly an hour before opening, checked every reservation, folded fresh linen napkins, polished crystal glasses, and greeted each coworker by name. She opened the envelopes she had carried home days earlier only after finishing her shift. Most contained ordinary bills. One letter came from the local community college confirming that her evening scholarship application remained under review. Claire smiled quietly before placing the letter back into its envelope. She never allowed hope to distract her from the responsibilities already in front of her. That afternoon, Emma surprised her father by asking a simple question during the drive home. "Do you think Claire ever wanted a different life?" Ethan glanced briefly toward his daughter before returning his eyes to the road. "Why do you ask?" Emma looked out the window. "She works harder than almost anyone I have ever seen, but she never looks unhappy. I wonder if she chose that life, or if life chose it for her." Ethan thought carefully before answering. Sometimes those are not the same thing. The following morning, his assistant quietly entered his office carrying a slim folder. "Everything I found came from public records and conversations with people willing to speak generally," she explained. Ethan opened the folder slowly. The first page immediately surprised him. Claire Bennett had graduated near the top of her university class with outstanding academic honors in organizational communication. Several recommendation letters described exceptional leadership, remarkable emotional intelligence, and unusual maturity for someone her age. Another page revealed that shortly after graduation, she had withdrawn from several promising job interviews. No explanation appeared in the official record. Ethan turned another page and found volunteer awards from neighborhood literacy programs, food banks, and community outreach events spanning several years. None had ever been publicized beyond local newsletters. His assistant spoke quietly. Everyone described her the same way: reliable, humble, thoughtful. Nobody mentioned ambition for personal recognition. Ethan remained silent. The final page contained one sentence from a former professor who had agreed to provide a general character reference. It read, "Claire Bennett possesses the rare ability to make every person feel significant without ever needing to become the center of attention herself." Ethan slowly closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. The woman he had dismissed with one careless sentence had once stood on the threshold of an entirely different future. Yet instead of bitterness, she had chosen grace. Instead of resentment, she had chosen service. Instead of proving her worth to the world, she had quietly lived it every single day. For the first time, Ethan realized that discovering Claire's past might not simply explain who she was. It might also reveal everything he had failed to see inside himself. The following evening, Ethan Carter remained alone in his office long after most of the building had emptied. Manhattan shimmered beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows while unopened reports rested untouched across his desk. Instead of reviewing financial projections, he found himself reading Claire Bennett's file for a second time. This time he paid less attention to her accomplishments and more attention to the quiet spaces between them. A brilliant university record suddenly ended. Promising career opportunities disappeared. Years passed without recognition. Something important had happened, yet no official document explained why. Ethan looked toward his assistant. "Can we learn what happened after graduation?" She nodded carefully. "Only through public information and people willing to speak voluntarily." Ethan agreed immediately. "Nothing intrusive. If the answer is private, we leave it there." 2 days later, another slim folder appeared on his desk. Inside was only a single page. Claire's former academic advisor had agreed to share one fact already known within the university community. Shortly after graduation, Claire's mother had been diagnosed with a serious long-term illness requiring daily care. Rather than beginning the corporate career everyone expected, Claire quietly declined every offer and returned home to become her mother's primary caregiver. The arrangement lasted nearly 5 years until her mother's peaceful passing. During that entire period, Claire worked evening restaurant shifts, completed online professional courses whenever time allowed, and volunteered at neighborhood literacy programs on weekends. Ethan slowly lowered the paper onto his desk. There was no headline celebrating sacrifice, no award recognizing devotion, no public fundraising campaign. There had only been thousands of ordinary days during which a young woman quietly chose responsibility over ambition without asking anyone to notice. That evening, Emma entered his office carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. She immediately recognized the thoughtful expression on her father's face. "You learned something else about Claire?" Ethan nodded. "She gave up the future everyone expected because someone she loved needed her more." Emma sat quietly across from him. "Does she regret it?" Ethan looked at the file before answering honestly. "Nothing I found suggests she ever complained." Emma smiled gently. "That sounds like her." The following Saturday, Ethan returned to the restaurant, not because he wanted another meal, but because he wanted to see whether knowing Claire's story would change the way he saw the ordinary moments unfolding around her. It did. He noticed the patience with which she explained menu options to an elderly customer whose hearing was fading. He noticed the way she thanked the dishwasher before every shift ended. He noticed that every employee, from the newest host to the head chef, smiled naturally whenever she approached. Respect surrounded Claire quietly because she offered it first. Near the end of the afternoon, a delivery driver accidentally left several heavy supply boxes near the entrance while rushing to another stop. Without hesitation, Claire rolled up the sleeves of her white shirt, lifted the boxes one at a time, and carried them toward the storage room before anyone needed to ask. Ethan instinctively stepped forward to help. Claire looked surprised for only a moment before smiling politely. Together, they carried the final box inside without speaking. As they reached the storage area, Ethan noticed an old framed photograph resting on a shelf beside employee lockers. It showed Claire years earlier wearing a graduation gown, standing beside an older woman whose proud smile seemed brighter than the summer sunlight surrounding them. Claire gently picked up the frame to keep it from falling as another employee reached for nearby supplies. She brushed a little dust from the glass with remarkable care before placing it back exactly where it belonged. Ethan understood immediately without asking a single question. Some dreams had been postponed. Some opportunities had quietly disappeared. Yet the love inside that photograph explained why Claire had never considered those years a loss. For the first time since their unforgettable meeting, Ethan realized the woman he had once dismissed with a single sentence possessed a success no balance sheet could ever measure. The quiet moment inside the storage room stayed with Ethan Carter long after he left the restaurant that afternoon. The image of Claire Bennett gently brushing dust from the photograph of her mother returned again and again, quietly replacing the memory of the words he wished he had never spoken. During the following week, he found himself measuring every important decision against a question he had never asked before. Would this choice build someone's future, or simply improve another quarterly report? The question refused to leave him. One evening, Emma noticed her father sitting alone in the family library, staring at the city lights instead of the documents spread across his desk. She quietly entered carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You have been thinking about Claire again," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan accepted the cup before nodding. "Yes." Emma settled into the chair beside him. "Are you trying to forgive yourself?" Ethan looked thoughtfully into the steam rising from the tea. "I think I am trying to understand why it has taken me so long to recognize what truly deserves respect." Emma smiled softly. "Maybe because people usually notice success before they notice sacrifice." Her words lingered in the silence. The following Friday, Ethan returned to the restaurant shortly before the dinner rush began. This time there were no business calls waiting, no urgent meetings, and no distractions competing for his attention. Claire greeted him exactly as she greeted every guest. Her calm smile remained unchanged. She escorted him to a familiar table near the window and placed a glass of water beside the menu. "Welcome back," she said warmly. "It is good to see you again." Ethan looked at her for a quiet moment. There was no hesitation left in his voice. "Thank you." Claire noticed something different immediately. The impatience that had once surrounded him seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a quiet humility she had not seen before. She took his order and continued serving the surrounding tables with her usual grace. When the restaurant became less busy, Ethan stood and approached the service station where Claire was organizing clean glasses. "May I speak with you for a moment?" he asked respectfully. Claire nodded. "Of course." Ethan drew a slow breath. "I have replayed that afternoon many times." Claire remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "I spoke to you with arrogance," he said. "I judged your worth without knowing anything about your life. I cannot change what I said, but I want you to know I was wrong." The words were spoken quietly enough that only Claire could hear them. She looked into his eyes for several seconds before answering. "Thank you for saying that." Ethan seemed almost surprised by the simplicity of her reply. "I expected you might still be angry." Claire smiled gently. "Anger is heavy. I learned a long time ago that carrying it every day only makes the journey harder." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "You forgave me?" Claire considered the question before answering. Forgiveness is not pretending something never happened. It is deciding that someone else's worst moment will not become the center of my life. Ethan felt the quiet truth of her words settle deeply within him. At that moment, Emma walked over carrying a folded piece of paper she had been protecting inside her backpack. She handed it to Claire with a shy smile. Inside was a new drawing of the lighthouse she had sketched days earlier. This time a small path of light stretched across the water toward waiting boats. Beneath the drawing, she had written only one sentence. "Thank you for showing my father the way home." Claire looked at the picture, then at Emma, before her eyes softened with quiet gratitude. She carefully folded the drawing and placed it inside the pocket of her black apron beside her heart, knowing that some gifts carried a value no amount of money could ever equal. The dinner crowd slowly filled the restaurant as another week passed, yet something subtle had changed beneath the familiar routine. Claire Bennett continued wearing the same black apron, greeting every guest with the same quiet warmth, and carrying each tray with steady hands. From the outside, nothing about her life appeared different. Inside Ethan Carter, however, the transformation continued. His apology had not erased the past, but it had opened a door he had nearly closed forever. Several days later, Ethan invited a small group of executives to lunch at the same restaurant before an important community investment meeting. It was not a coincidence. He wanted the people who helped shape his company to experience the kind of character that could never appear on a resume. Claire welcomed the group with the same professional smile she offered every customer. None of the executives recognized her, and she made no effort to mention that she had met Ethan before. Throughout the meal, she quietly anticipated every request before anyone asked, remembered dietary preferences after hearing them only once, and treated the newest assistant at the table with exactly the same respect she showed the senior executives. Ethan noticed every detail. More importantly, so did everyone else. Near the end of lunch, one executive leaned toward Ethan and quietly remarked, "Your staff chose an exceptional restaurant. Their service feels genuinely human." Ethan smiled faintly. That is because some people understand that excellence begins long before recognition. Claire happened to pass nearby carrying fresh coffee, unaware that the conversation concerned her. After the meeting concluded, Ethan asked the executives to leave without him. Emma arrived a few minutes later after school, carrying another sketchbook beneath her arm. She smiled brightly when she saw Claire. "I finished another drawing," she said. Claire laughed softly. "You are becoming quite an artist." Emma looked proudly toward her father before handing Claire the picture. It showed a small bridge stretching across a wide river. On one side stood a businessman. On the other stood a waitress wearing a black apron. In the middle, both were walking toward each other beneath a bright morning sky. Claire studied the drawing with quiet emotion. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Emma smiled. "My teacher said bridges are built from both sides." Ethan felt those words settle deeply inside him. Claire carefully folded the drawing before placing it beside the first one inside the pocket of her apron. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I will keep both of them." Ethan looked at Claire before speaking again. "There is something I would like to ask you." Claire nodded patiently. "Go ahead." Ethan chose his words carefully. "My family's foundation is expanding several community education programs next year. We need people who understand leadership, compassion, and service. Would you consider meeting with our team to learn more?" Claire remained thoughtful for a moment before answering. "I appreciate the invitation." Ethan waited quietly. She continued with the same calm honesty that had defined every conversation they had ever shared. "But I would only feel comfortable if I went through the same application process as everyone else. I would not want an opportunity that belongs to someone more qualified simply because we happen to meet here." Ethan smiled, not with disappointment, but with admiration. "That is exactly the answer I hoped you would give." Emma looked from one adult to the other and quietly realized that respect had finally replaced judgment. No victory had been won through anger. No lesson had required revenge. Everything had changed because one person refused to surrender her dignity, and another finally found the courage to admit he had been wrong. Several months passed almost unnoticed, marked not by dramatic events, but by quiet, steady progress. Claire Bennett continued arriving at the restaurant before sunrise, tying the same black apron around her waist and greeting every coworker with the same warmth that had always defined her. She never spoke about Ethan Carter's invitation, nor did she expect anything to come from it. Instead, she completed the foundation application exactly as every other candidate did, answering each question honestly without mentioning that she already knew the organization's founder. When the interview day arrived, she entered the building carrying only a simple folder and the confidence that came from living according to her values rather than depending upon outcomes. The interview panel knew nothing about her connection to Ethan because he had deliberately removed himself from the selection process. He wanted every decision to reflect fairness instead of gratitude. Claire spoke about leadership through service, about listening before speaking, and about treating every person with equal respect regardless of title or circumstance. She never described herself as extraordinary. She simply explained the lessons she had learned while caring for her mother, serving strangers, and discovering that quiet consistency often changes lives more deeply than dramatic gestures. Weeks later, the final decisions were announced. Claire received a position leading one of the foundation's new community mentoring programs, not because of personal influence, but because every interviewer independently ranked her among the strongest candidates. When Ethan read the committee's evaluation, he smiled quietly. Nearly every reviewer had written the same observation. Claire possessed an uncommon ability to help people feel seen, valued, and capable. Emma celebrated the news as though a close family member had succeeded. "I knew they would choose her," she said happily. Ethan smiled. "They chose her for the right reasons." Claire continued working at the restaurant during the transition period, determined to leave only after properly training the new employees who would replace many of her shifts. She patiently taught them how to remember guests' names, how to notice when someone seemed lonely, and how kindness often began with small details that never appeared in an employee handbook. On her final evening before beginning the new role, the restaurant manager gathered the staff after closing. There were no grand speeches, only sincere gratitude shared among people who had worked beside her for years. One young server quietly admitted, "You never taught us only how to serve food. You taught us how to serve people." Claire smiled modestly. "I learned that from many people before you. Now it belongs to all of us." As everyone prepared to leave, Ethan and Emma quietly entered through the front door, carrying no gifts except a handwritten card. Emma handed it to Claire with a bright smile. Inside were only a few simple words. "You never needed anyone to prove your worth. You simply reminded everyone else to find theirs." Claire closed the card gently and looked at Ethan. "Thank you for giving every applicant a fair opportunity." Ethan shook his head softly. "You earned every step yourself. My only responsibility was making sure the door remained open to everyone equally." Claire nodded with quiet appreciation. Walking outside together beneath the cool evening sky, they paused for a moment before going their separate ways. No promises were made. No grand celebrations were needed. The greatest change had already happened long before that evening. A careless judgment had become lasting respect. A painful sentence had become an enduring lesson. And both of them understood that the strongest lives are never built by proving someone else wrong, but by quietly remaining true to who we are, even when the world briefly fails to see our value. 1 year later, the restaurant looked almost exactly the same. The polished windows still reflected the morning light across the sidewalk. The familiar scent of fresh coffee still welcomed every guest who stepped inside. The quiet music still floated gently through the dining room. Some places change very little because they have already learned what truly matters. Claire Bennett walked through the front door shortly after opening, no longer wearing the black apron that had become part of her daily life for so many years. She had returned only to visit the co-workers who had once become her second family. The restaurant manager greeted her with a warm embrace before proudly introducing her to several new employees. "This is Claire," he said with an unmistakable smile. "Many of the little things we still do every day began with her." Claire laughed softly. "I think kindness was already here. I simply had the privilege of learning from all of you." Across town, the community mentoring program had quietly flourished beyond every expectation. Young adults searching for a second chance, parents rebuilding their lives, and students uncertain about their future often left Claire's office carrying something impossible to measure. They left believing in themselves again. She never spoke about success as though it belonged to a few fortunate people. She spoke about small choices repeated faithfully every day. Ethan Carter visited the center only occasionally, never as the billionaire who funded the program, but as a volunteer willing to listen, mentor, and learn alongside everyone else. The greatest lesson he had received there had not come from any business strategy or leadership seminar. It had begun with a quiet waitress who refused to let another person's judgment define her. Emma had grown taller over the year, but her sketchbook remained close at hand wherever she went. One Saturday afternoon, she surprised Claire with another drawing. This one showed a simple cafe window glowing beneath the morning sun. Inside stood a waitress wearing a black apron. Outside stood a businessman holding the hand of his daughter. None of them appeared extraordinary. They were simply smiling. At the bottom of the page, Emma had written, "Some people change your life without ever trying to." Claire looked at the drawing for several silent moments before carefully placing it beside the lighthouse and bridge drawings she had kept all along. Ethan smiled as he watched her. "You saved every one of them." Claire nodded gently. "Because they remind me that kindness always travels farther than we realize." As the afternoon faded into evening, Ethan, Emma, and Claire stepped outside together. The streets of Manhattan bustled with thousands of strangers hurrying toward places that seemed urgent. They stood quietly for one final moment before each followed a different path home. No audience applauded. No cameras captured the moment. The city continued exactly as it always had. Yet somewhere within that endless movement, 3 lives had been permanently changed by one careless sentence, one quiet smile, one sincere apology, and countless small acts of dignity that followed. Ethan watched Claire disappear into the crowd before turning toward Emma. "You know," he said softly, "I once believed success meant being respected by the world." Emma slipped her hand into his. "What do you believe now?" Ethan smiled with peaceful certainty. "I believe success is becoming someone who gives other people a reason to believe in themselves." Emma looked back one last time toward the busy sidewalk where Claire had vanished among ordinary people living ordinary days. She smiled because she understood something many adults spend a lifetime searching for. The people who appear the quietest are often carrying the greatest strength, and the truest measure of a human life is never found in power, wealth, or status, but in the quiet dignity that remains unchanged when nobody is watching. True worth never asks for permission to exist.